By late summer of 1944, few other than a megalomaniac such as Adolf Hitler could have discerned any hope for the beleaguered National Socialist state that Hitler called the Third Reich. Like other German rulers before him, the Führer faced the dilemma of fighting a two-front war east and west, however much he had tried to avoid it. After conquering France, he had attempted to lure the British into a separate peace. When that failed, he launched what was meant to be a lightning campaign of annihilation against the Untermenschen of Russia, whereupon, having knocked from Britannia's hand the last continental sword at Britain's disposal, he could effectively deal with the British. Yet that strategy too had foundered, on the reef of Russian nationalism and in the sea of Russia's vast expanses. By late summer of 1944, the Allied armies that had come ashore on June 6th in Normandy and on August 15th in southern France controlled almost all of France, Belgium and Luxembourg, and stood little more than 50 miles from the Ruhr industrial region, whose mines, smelters and factories were vital to the survival of the German war machine. In Italy, other Allied armies were close to breaking into the Po Valley, not far from the southern frontier of the Reich, and in the east during the course of the summer, the Red Army had driven 400 miles from deep inside White Russia to the Vistula River across from the Polish capital of Warsaw, an advance that conquered half of Poland and put Russian soldiers virtually on the frontier of East Prussia. Red Army troops had been in the Romanian capital of Bucharest for nearly a fortnight and were almost at the gates of the Bulgarian capital of Sofia. Their advances had forced German withdrawal from Greece and had precipitated the kind of defection of Germany's allies that had presaged collapse in World War I. Italy had long since given in and become a battleground Bulgaria, and Romania had defected, with Finland about to follow, and only the presence of German divisions kept Hungary from doing the same. In 5 years of war, the German armed forces had lost almost 3.75 million men, the elite of German manpower. Essential raw materials from Russia, the Balkans, Finland and France were no longer to be had, and neutral Sweden was becoming increasingly reluctant to provide its iron ore to a nation that appeared about to collapse. 1,000-plane raids by Allied bombers on German cities had become commonplace. Yet Adolf Hitler still saw hope, or professed that he did. For all the immense losses in battle, Germany had close to 10 million men in uniform, including 7.5 million in the army and another ground combat force, a kind of Praetorian Guard of the Nazi Party, the Waffenschutzstaffel, or SS. There were still others who could be committed to the fight. Heretofore deferred students, men with less than crippling physical defects, non-essential government workers, convalescents from the hospitals, sailors and airmen turned into foot soldiers. New classes made available for the draft simply by extending the age limit at both ends of the induction spectrum. Nor was there concern, as there had been in 1918, about collapse of the home front. The police state had eliminated the internal red threat, or at least driven it underground, so that not once during the war years had the ugly noise of street demonstrations reached Hitler's ears. So too, the air raids and the demand of his enemies for unconditional surrender had cemented the will of the German people. However damaging the 1,000 plane raids, they had failed to prevent German industry from maintaining a remarkably high rate of production. Indeed, not until the late fall of 1944 was German production to reach a wartime peak. Smaller industries had been dispersed to the countryside or moved to the east, where the Russians had few big bombers. A new decree would put workers on a 60-hour week, impressed foreign workers would be driven ever harder, and production of civilian goods would be drastically cut. By those methods, German industry during the fall of 1944 was to produce a record 1.25 million tons of ammunition, 750,000 rifles, 100,000 machine guns, and 9,000 artillery pieces. Only in tanks was production to decline, and that would be partially offset by record production of self-propelled assault guns from factories previously moved beyond the range of Allied bombers to Czechoslovakia. Hitler also put great store by a new weapon of which some models were already appearing, jet-propelled fighter aircraft 3 times faster than anything flown by Allied pilots. Once the new jets got into action in substantial numbers, Hitler maintained, they would sweep Allied planes from German skies. What Hitler needed was time. For all the crises on the Eastern Front, Hitler was still capable of gaining time there simply by utilizing the age-old process of trading it for space. Although Russian penetration onto the soil of the Reich in East Prussia would be a heavy psychological blow, there was nothing in East Prussia absolutely vital to German survival. At the Vistula, the Red Army was still 300 miles from any really critical objective, such as the capital Berlin or the coalfields and industry of Silesia. In any case, the current Russian offensive had run its course, supply lines too taut to support another great lunge forward until well into the winter. The Western Front was another matter, for there the Allied armies threatened the vital Ruhr. Yet hope Hitler could see on the Western Front as well. Like the Russians, the Allies had outrun their supply lines, and by ordering die-hard holdouts in the French and Belgian ports, even as the German armies fell back toward the frontier, he had ensured that for some time to come, the Allies would still have to base their supplies on the Normandy beaches or on ports far from the front. There was also the factor of the border fortifications on the western frontier, the combination of concrete anti-tank obstacles, pillboxes and bunkers known to the German soldier as Westwall, and to the Allied soldier as the Siegfried Line. No matter how dated those defences, Hitler maintained that concrete in any form lent impetus to the defence, and besides, the terrain along the frontier was forbidding. Space in the east, fortifications and inhospitable terrain in the west thus spelled time, but in the final accounting, time alone was not enough. To stand beleaguered on the defensive while his enemies gradually strangled him was no solution. He had to go over to the offensive, strike a blow that would change everything, prove decisive. There was no hope for such a decisive blow in the east. The number of new and refitted divisions Hitler could muster for an offensive would simply be swallowed by the great distances and ingested by the Red Army's multitudes. Besides, there was no chance there for a separate peace, for Hitler saw Germany as the last bulwark against the forces of unholy communism with which he could never traffic. By way of Japan, there had been indications that the Russian dictator, Joseph Stalin, might be willing to parley, but Hitler forbade any dickering with the Untermenschen. Probing the Soviet attitude, he wrote the wife of his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, is like touching a glowing stove to find out if it's hot. The situation in the West was a different matter. Not only were the distances shorter, the strategic objectives within acceptable range, and the opposing forces far less overwhelming in numbers. Hitler also saw a real possibility of inducing the Allies, for all their proud decrees about unconditional surrender, to accept a separate peace. Never in history as he perceived it had war produced such strange bedfellows as the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. Ultra-capitalist states on one side, he would tell his generals on the eve of his big offensive, ultra-Marxist states on the other, on one side a dying empire Britain, on the other side a colony the United States, waiting to claim its inheritance. Each of the three, he said, was determined either to cheat the others out of something or get something out of it. A great victory on the Western Front, Hitler declared, would bring down this artificial coalition with a crash. It was absurd for Anglo-American armies to fight a war which, if Germany were defeated, would allow the mucky fingers of communism to grub about in Western Europe. Impossible strains among such strange bedfellows would surely develop, and already Hitler thought he detected them, including some in the Anglo-American alliance. If he could destroy the British and Canadian armies, Britain would be unable to replace its losses, and Canada would hardly be inclined to send another contingent to the slaughter. In which case, would the United States be willing to continue the absurd fight alone? It was obvious that the survival of the United States of America itself was not at stake, and the enemy in the Pacific, Japan, not Germany, had sullied American honor at Pearl Harbor. If a catastrophic blow to the Allied armies should precipitate a separate peace that would enable Hitler to turn a still powerful army and all Germany's resources to putting an end to the Red Menace, thus fulfilling his ambition to destroy communism and the pagan Russian hordes utterly, to level Moscow and Leningrad, blotting their names forever from geography and history alike. Had not Frederick the Great, who among all the military leaders of history was Hitler's idol, whose maxims were always on the tip of the Führer's tongue to silence the pessimist, invoke new sacrifice or justify cruel discipline, and whose portrait hung behind the desk in Hitler's study in the Reichschancellery, faced vastly superior forces converging on his kingdom in the 7 Years' War. And had not Frederick, by engaging and defeating his enemies one by one, hung on until the historical accident of the death of the Empress Elizabeth of Russia brought to the throne one of Frederick's admirers, Peter III, which split the coalition opposing him. Under intense adversity, would the unholy alliance of capitalism and Bolshevism hold up any better? With the British and Canadian armies wiped out, would it not become obvious to the American people that their sons were dying to impose on Western Europe the dictatorship of the proletariat? As early as the last day of July 1944, when the Allied armies were about to break out of their Normandy beachhead, Hitler, who to that point had adamantly refused to sanction any withdrawal and replaced his commander-in-chief in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for proposing it, admitted to a few intimates that eventual withdrawal to the West Wall might be the only recourse. That would mean, in time, an offensive mounted from behind the protection of the West Wall, a decision which Hitler revealed to a select group on August 19th. He planned, he said, to launch an offensive on the Western Front at the beginning of November, when heavy fog and rain-poor campaigning weather traditionally came to northwestern Europe, weather that would seriously interfere with the operations of the Allied air forces. Not quite a fortnight later, on September 1st, Hitler called to the Wolfschanze the man he had so recently removed from command, Gerd von Rundstedt, and asked him to return as commander-in-chief in the West. A wizened, venerable old soldier, von Rundstedt was to most Germans the paragon of all that was good and right about the German officer corps. Hitler disliked him intensely, partly because he was such an obvious exemplar of that elite corps with its plumy elegance, whose officers Hitler knew saw him in his role as supreme military commander as an impostor, and partly because Hitler also knew that in private conversations von Rundstedt referred to him mockingly by his rank in the Great War as the corporal. On the other hand, after having been relieved in France, von Rundstedt had demonstrated his loyalty by presiding over a court of honor to expel those officers associated with the attempt on the Führer's life. Besides, Hitler needed a proud figurehead around which the troops might rally. He needed someone whose presence as commander-in-chief might lull Allied commanders, who would expect that such an experienced and capable old soldier would conduct his campaign according to accepted canons of the military art. At the meeting in the Wolfschanze, Hitler treated von Rundstedt with unwanted diffidence and respect, while the old soldier sat there motionless and monosyllabic. But as a loyal German, von Rundstedt agreed to serve. He was to defend for as long as possible in front of the West Wall, then fall back on the fortifications for the decisive battle. Everything depended on that battle, Hitler stressed, for under the conditions existing in the Third Reich, there was insufficient strength to mount an offensive. Having thus deceived his commander-in-chief, Hitler set about creating the conditions for his offensive. To his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, he gave the assignment of combing the country for enough untapped manpower to create 25 new divisions, while others might later be culled from Finland and Norway. To assure von Rundstedt's holding the line, he accorded the Western Front priority on tanks coming off the assembly lines, but to create an armoured force to form the steel heart of the offensive, he ordered the 4 SS Panzer divisions then fighting in the west to be pulled from the line and refitted, without telling von Rundstedt why. To control the armour, he created a new headquarters, the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by a hard-drinking old crony from the early street-brawling days of the Nazi Party, SS Obergruppenführer Josef Dietrich. Although von Rundstedt appealed for reinforcements from the new formations, Hitler refused all but minimal help, for as he had anticipated, the Allied armies had outrun their supply lines and would soon grind to a halt. There was a spasmodic climax, an attempt with 3 airborne divisions to gain bridgeheads over the canals and sprawling rivers of the Netherlands, including the Lower Rhine, and turn the flank of the West Wall. But when that failed, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had no recourse for a time but to accept a slow, grinding battle of attrition. As Hitler began more detailed planning for his offensive, one factor remained constant, the goal of destroying the British and Canadian armies, which were located in the far north, mostly in the Netherlands. Although the British had seized the great Belgian port of Antwerp, German troops upon Hitler's specific order still held onto the banks of the Schelde estuary, which connects the port with the North Sea, and thereby denied Allied ships the use of the harbour. Yet it could be expected that Antwerp would eventually be opened and serve as the principal port for Allied supplies. Since a drive to Antwerp would not only deny the Allies the port, but also trap the British and Canadian armies, Antwerp was a strategic objective of the First Order. That objective ruled out launching the offensive against the Allied south wing, for from the Vosges mountains of Alsace or the hills of Lorraine in northeastern France, the route to Antwerp was too long. The shortest distance, no more than 60 miles, was in the north, along the boundary between the American and British armies north of the old Carolingian capital of Aachen. But there, the multiple rivers and canals posed serious obstacles to tanks. That left the Ardennes, a region that had long fascinated Hitler, where German armies had attacked with tremendous success in 1914, and again, at Hitler's personal instigation, in 1940. At that point, Hitler had no way of knowing how strong the Allied line might be in the Ardennes by the time his offensive was ready. Indeed, even as he reached his decision, there was considerable concern about a drive by a corps of the American First Army through the Ardennes and into the contiguous region inside Germany known as the Eifel. There, 2 American infantry divisions had crossed the frontier and penetrated a thinly fortified sector of the West Wall near and astride a high ridgeline, the Schnee Eifel, while a few miles to the south, an armoured division had crossed Luxembourg, penetrated the West Wall, and headed for the crossroads town of Bitburg. Not until September 17th were hastily assembled troops able to halt the drive at the Schnee Eifel, and even then the Americans retained control of the ridge. Only 4 days later would German pressure force the armoured division to abandon its thrust on Bitburg and retire into Luxembourg. On the other hand, Hitler might well expect that Allied commanders in 1944 would view the Ardennes, much as their predecessors had in 1914 and 1940, as being too compartmented and too heavily forested to accommodate a major offensive. The supreme Allied commander in World War I, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, had called the Ardennes an almost impenetrable massif, and one of his generals, Charles Lanrezac, reputedly said, "If you go into that death trap of the Ardennes, you will never come out." If Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1944 held a similar view, he too would accord little credibility to the possibility of a German thrust through the Ardennes, so that an attack there could be expected to hit a weak point in the Allied line. Some days before Hitler made his dramatic announcement at the Wolfschanze on September 16th, he had directed his plans and operations officer General Jodl to study the possibility of an offensive in the Ardennes, and he himself had pored over the results. Opposite the Ardennes, inside Germany, dense forests in the Eifel region provided a ready cloak for the assembly of an attacking force, and however restrictive the terrain, German armies had demonstrated in 1940 that mobile forces could negotiate the Ardennes swiftly. From the frontier, the route through the Ardennes to the strategic objective of Antwerp was little more than 100 miles as the Messerschmitt flew, and a drive to Antwerp through the Ardennes would trap not only the British and Canadians, but also the American 1st and 9th Armies around Aachen, fully half the Allied forces on the continent, a prize as alluring as that gained in the dash to the sea in 1940. Any coalition that lost half its field strength would surely collapse. At the very least, the offensive would eliminate the immediate threat to the Ruhr, thus enabling Hitler to draw on the Western Front for troops to meet the next big lunge by the Red Army. Although Hitler was aware that he could muster no such power as he had employed in 1940, particularly in the air, he saw methods of overcoming that. It would certainly be November before the new and refitted divisions were ready, and by choosing a period of prolonged bad weather, he would assure that his panzer divisions were well on the way to Antwerp before clearing weather enabled the Allied planes to operate. So too, he expected to be in Antwerp before Eisenhower could mount a major riposte. For Eisenhower first would have to determine the extent of the offensive, and in responding to such a strategic threat to forces of 3 nationalities, so Hitler reasoned the armies of a democratic alliance would require decision at the political level. That too would take time. At the Wolfschanze on September 25th, Hitler spelled out in more detail what he had in mind. The artillery preparation was to be massive, followed by infantry assault to achieve a swift penetration and enable a first wave of panzer divisions to begin a rapid drive to seize bridgeheads over the Meuse River, a major military obstacle defining the western and northern reaches of the Ardennes. Quick seizure of bridgeheads over the Meuse was essential for continuing the thrust to Antwerp. At that point, a second wave of panzer divisions was to be committed, while infantry divisions followed and peeled off north and south to protect the flanks of the penetration. The Schwerpunkt of the offensive was to be delivered by the 4 SS panzer divisions of the 6th Panzer Army, a manifestation of Hitler's faith in the loyalty and ability of the SS units, which even as late as the fall of 1944 were made up in large measure of volunteers. The main effort was to be supported by Army panzer divisions under another recently created headquarters. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by a successful and trusted general brought from the Eastern Front, Hasso von Manteuffel, while infantry divisions under the 7th Army, commanded by General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger, were to protect the south flank of the penetration. The offensive would require a minimum of 30 divisions, a third of them armoured, and Hitler expected the Luftwaffe to support the offensive with more than 1,000 planes. While charging Jodl and his operations staff with devising a detailed plan of operations, the Führer also ordered them to draw up a comprehensive cover and deception plan for, as Hitler emphasized, secrecy was basic to the plan. Everybody let in on the plan, including clerks and typists, was to sign a pledge of secrecy upon pain of death. Field commanders, including Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself, who was to be the overall commander, were to be brought in only as time, detailed planning and assembly of forces required. Hitler may have forgotten that he himself had already been less than discreet about his intentions when, 3 weeks earlier on September 4th, the Japanese ambassador to Berlin, Baron Hiroshi Oshima, had called at the Wolfschanze, in company with the German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, for another of what had come to be periodic conferences. Probably because Japan was Nazi Germany's only ally with muscle, Hitler had long been candid with the Japanese ambassador. Yet as the defeats in the field multiplied, he had become uncharacteristically defensive. When Oshima expressed some concern about the perils facing Germany, Hitler assured him that he still had ample resources for restoring the situation. "When the current replenishment of the air forces is completed," said Hitler, "and the new army of more than 1 million men which is now being organized is ready, I intend to combine the new units with units to be withdrawn from all possible areas and to open a large-scale offensive in the west." The news astounded Oshima when he asked, to which Hitler replied, "After the beginning of November." A few days later, Baron Oshima reported the conversation to his government in Tokyo, where, as in Berlin, nobody was aware that since mid-1941 the United States had been intercepting and decrypting Japanese diplomatic wireless traffic, a process known by the codename Magic. By means of Magic, Oshima's report that Hitler was planning a large-scale offensive in the West to start sometime after the beginning of November was on the desks of intelligence officers in the Pentagon in Washington almost as soon as it reached the desks of the Foreign Office in Tokyo. In Julius Caesar's time, the Ardennes region of what was to become Belgium and Luxembourg constituted the most extensive forest in all Gaul. But over the centuries, as the region passed under the control of one ruler after another, including Charlemagne, much of the land was cleared by agriculture and animal husbandry, so that by the start of the 20th century, only about half of it was still wooded. The most extensive stands that remained were in the east, close to the borders with Germany, almost all of them coniferous, stately firs harvested from time to time for timber, then replanted in orderly rows. Between the 2 world wars, the Ardennes became a haven for tourists, its countryside dotted with picturesque villages with narrow streets, and here and there abbeys and castles, or the ruins of them, a place where tourists partook of the region's renowned venison, wild boar, and marvellously succulent cured ham. A westward extension of the high plateau of the Eifel, so deeply etched through the centuries by serpentine streams that it appears to be less plateau than mountains, the Ardennes presents a rugged face scarred by deep gorges and twisting stream valleys. It has the shape of a big isosceles triangle with an 80-mile base along the frontiers, extending from an ill-defined point in the north near the Belgian town of Eupen to the vicinity of Luxembourg City in the south. Although part of the region protrudes westward beyond the Meuse River, so deep and broad is the cut of the Meuse that for military purposes the region can be said to end there, some 60 miles from the base of the triangle. As the most extensive stands of forest are close to the German frontier, so too is the most forbidding terrain. For almost the entire length of the frontier, the terrain poses a major obstacle to military movement. In the north rises the Haute Fagne, in effect a ridgeline, whose crest marks the highest elevation in the Ardennes. It is an almost trackless moor, covered with forest or peat bogs, the latter providing the source of medicinal waters for the thermal baths of Aachen and of Spa, the Belgian resort whose name long ago passed into English as a synonym for thermal watering places. Southeast of the Haute Fagnes in Belgium's easternmost reaches dense forests mark the frontier to the vicinity of a road centre, Saint-Vith. Because American troops who attacked there in September held onto the nearby prominent feature just inside Germany, the Schnee Eifel, that ridgeline in the fall of 1944 constituted a part of the obstacles to be faced by any attacker from the east. The Little Our River, which rises in eastern Belgium, becomes a major obstacle as it crosses into Luxembourg, where it marks the frontier and flows through a gorge whose almost cliff-like sides are covered with firs. The roads leading west toil upward to a high ridge, which American troops familiar with the Shenandoah Mountains of Virginia called the Skyline Drive. Behind that ridge lies another gorge cut by the Clerve and Cher rivers. After absorbing the waters of the Clerve, the Cher drains southeastward to the frontier, where it absorbs the Our and forms the border with Germany until it joins the Moselle River northeast of Luxembourg City at roughly the southern terminus of the Ardennes. Along the entire stretch of the Ardennes near the frontier, only one corridor at all conducive to military movement exists, a sector some 5 miles wide, beginning at the northern end of the Schnee Eifel. Taking its name from the village of Losheim, just inside Germany, it is known as the Losheim Gap. The term gap is relative, for even though it lacks extensive forest along the frontier, a belt of woodland 2 miles thick has to be crossed before gaining more open country a few miles deeper into Belgium, and the hills are steep, the valleys deep. Nevertheless, as the Kaiser's armies entered the Ardennes in 1914, a force heavy in horse cavalry pushed through the Losheim Gap in advance of the main body and quickly reached the Meuse. From the high ground along the frontier, the terrain slopes gradually downward toward the west, losing some of its convulsive nature except for tortuous meanderings of streams through deep valleys in the extreme north and south. In the centre, around Bastogne, the true nature of the region as a plateau is readily discernible, no more of an obstacle to military movement than is always present in a gently rolling landscape. Beyond the Little Our the river, roughly 2/3 of the distance to the Meuse, the same rolling hills prevail, for the most part the rest of the way to the Meuse. The Meuse itself follows a south-north course before swinging northeast at the town of Namur. After washing the industrial wastes of one of Belgium's principal cities, Liège, it finally resumes a northward course through the Netherlands to the sea. The road net for such a pastoral region was extensive, although the roads usually twisted and turned in conformity with the stream valleys, and in many places passed through thick forests or sharp defiles where they might be readily blocked. As an added obstacle, at every crossroads or road junction stood either a closely knit town or village, or at least a collection of stone farm buildings, which almost always constricted the width of the road. Although most of the railroads had been put back into service for military traffic by late 1944, the repairs ended some miles short of the German frontier, and without connections to lines inside Germany, railroads in the Ardennes would have little bearing on the fighting to come. Not so across the frontier in the Eifel. There, in countryside even more heavily forested than that of the Ardennes, the Germans, in preparing for the onset of World War I, had constructed a number of rail lines feeding from marshalling yards at Cologne in the north, and Koblenz in the south, and from other crossings of the Rhine River in between. Since the distance between the Rhine and the western frontier is only about 45 miles, trains moving along those spur lines have relatively short hauls. The lines lead to towns that are also road centres, Bitburg in the South Prum, and Gerolstein in the shadow of the Schnee Eifel, and Geymond and Schleiden in the north. Although the sole arterial line runs along the valley of the Moselle on the southern periphery of the region to the old Roman outpost town of Trier, Spur lines lead north from marshalling yards at Trier to Bitburg and the other road centres within the Eifel. There are no cities in the Eifel and few in the Ardennes. Except for Liège on the northern periphery and Luxembourg City and Arlon to the south, there are only the picturesque villages and an occasional town with a population of 2,000 to 5,000. Yet those towns pull together a number of roads and then release them in various directions. So Saint-Vith near the frontier Malmedy in the north, and Bastogne and Houffalize in the centre, would become critical features in any military advance. The people of Luxembourg reflect a fierce independence, befitting a region that has been a separate entity, although not always autonomous, since the 10th century. Of Germanic descent, they speak a dialect, Letzenburgisch, which to the American soldier sounded like German. The population of the Belgian Ardennes is composed primarily of French-speaking Walloons, but in the northeastern corner, most are ethnic Germans, reflecting the fact that before the Treaty of Versailles, the easternmost province Eupen-et-Malmedy had long been a part of Germany. In late 1944, in such border towns as Eupen and Saint-Vith, shop signs were in Old German script, and almost all the people spoke German. Many, even a majority, might be loyal to Belgium, but the American soldier did not trust them. Almost every home had a photograph of a father or son in German uniform, and few American soldiers bothered to reason that ethnic Germans in regions conquered by the German army had no choice but to serve the fatherland. Situated not far from the North Sea, the Ardennes has a harsh, wet climate with rainfall averaging 35 to 40 inches a year. Some of the heaviest rains come in November and early December, so saturating the soil that any movement off the roads is difficult, and with them comes the fog or mist that sometimes fails to clear before midday and reappears again in late afternoon. Snow sometimes accumulates up to a foot in depth deeper in the drifts, and cold, raw winds sweep the heights. As American intelligence officers would consistently note, the Ardennes presented little attraction for anybody except a tourist. Surely it proffered nothing of strategic importance to German armies forced back on their homeland in desperate straits. Yet that was reckoning without the fact that by way of the Ardennes it was just over 100 miles, as the Messerschmitt flew to Antwerp. Although Hitler had specifically directed that his offensive be made through the Ardennes, Alfred Jodl and his planning staff studied various alternatives, eventually settling on 5, only one of which involved that part of the Ardennes which Hitler had specified, and even that failed to name Antwerp as the objective. As proposed by the planners, that operation would consist of 2 prongs, a main effort passing through the Ardennes, and then turning north, where it would meet a thrust launched from the vicinity of Aachen, a shallow double envelopment which could be expected to trap not the British and Canadians, but just the American 1st and 9th Armies. Proposing the alternative plans may have been simply a logical procedure for men with general staff-trained minds, on the other hand. The plan for a shallow envelopment may have been a subtle attempt by Jodl to modify Hitler's grandiose scheme, to reduce it to the dimensions a trained and experienced military planner such as Jodl recognized as within German capabilities. If such a ploy it was, it failed. The effect was not to lessen Hitler's ambition, but to increase it, for he liked the idea of supplementing the Ardennes thrust with a second prong originating near Aachen and on Antwerp. As an objective, he was immovable. As finally worked out by Jodl and his staff, the offensive was to be launched along a 60-mile front from Monschau in the north, some 20 miles southeast of Aachen, whence led the only lateral road across the Haute-Fagne, to the medieval town of Echternach in the south, downstream from the juncture of the Our and Schur rivers. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, comprising the Schwerpunkt, was to attack along a front extending from Monschau to a point within the Lossheim Gap, with a panzer division debouching from the gap to follow the path of Erwin Rommel's division in 1940, bypassing opposition and quickly gaining and crossing the Meuse. Dietrich was to pass south of Liège, cross the Meuse upstream from the city, then head for Antwerp while anchoring his northern flank on the considerable obstacle of the Albert Canal. On Dietrich's left, General von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was to attack through and south of Saint-Vith, cross the Skyline Drive, jump the Meuse upstream from the bend in the river at Namur, and then wheel northwest, bypassing the Belgian capital, Brussels, and protecting the 6th Panzer Army's southern flank. Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army, made up primarily of infantry, was to attack on either side of Echternach, and while advancing westward was to peel off divisions to block to the south. 48 hours after the offensive in the Ardennes began, the 15th Army, composed of infantry reinforced by a panzer and a panzer grenadier division, was to be prepared to attack from the vicinity of Aachen. The basic objective was to pin down American divisions and prevent them from reinforcing in the Ardennes. But if all went well, the attack was to continue southward to reach the Meuse near Liège and trap the Americans around Aachen. Although Hitler spoke grandly of yet another attack in Alsace to tie down American divisions there, plans for that attack, like that by the 15th Army, remained indefinite. So did a suggestion that Army Group H, which defended in the Netherlands, might drive through the Canadians to link with the 6th Panzer Army at Antwerp, thereby constricting the trap around the Allied armies. Nobody said anything about how the Germans were going to liquidate the more than 1 million Allied troops who would presumably be trapped. Accepting the plan, Hitler continued his deception by giving it a codename, Operation Wacht am Rhein, designed to provide a defensive rather than offensive connotation. The next day, the head of the OKW, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, issued a general order to all commanders on the Western Front, asserting that for the moment no German offensive was possible, that the saving of the fatherland depended upon unyielding defense. During the afternoon of the same day that Hitler approved Jodel's plan, October 21st, he received at the Wolfschanze someone he held in special respect, a blonde giant of a man who, like Hitler himself, was Austrian Otto Skorzeny. It was Skorzeny who in 1943 had rescued Hitler's friend and erstwhile ally, Benito Mussolini, from a mountaintop in Italy, where he was being held in the wake of Italy's defection, and only a few days before the visit to the Wolfschanze. Skorzeny had led a successful raid on the seat of the Hungarian government in the citadel in Budapest to prevent Hungary's defection. Possibly as an indication of something of the Führer's admiration and trust, Skorzeny may have been the only person briefed in early stages of the planning for Wacht am Rhein, from whom Hitler exacted no written pledge of secrecy. Wearing the uniform of an SS major, Skorzeny entered Hitler's study and received a warm handshake. "Well done," Skorzeny exclaimed the Führer. He had promoted him, he said, to Obersturmbannführer and awarded him the German Cross in gold. After hearing Skorzeny's account of the operation in Budapest, Hitler began a lengthy recitation of Wacht am Rhein. "One of the most important tasks in this offensive," he said at last, "will be entrusted to you and the units under your command." Skorzeny was to form a special brigade that would precede the attacking armies and seize bridges over the Meuse. The troops were to wear American uniforms, which would enable small detachments to cause the greatest confusion by cutting communications and passing false orders. "I know," Hitler concluded, "you will do your best." A few days later, Skorzeny was dismayed to come upon an order signed by a senior officer of the OKW. At the top were the words, "Secret Commando Operations." Units throughout the army, the order read, were to send in the names of all English-speaking officers and men who are prepared to voluntarily apply for transfer for a special operation under Skorzeny. All units were also to turn in any captured American vehicles, uniforms and other equipment. Skorzeny was livid. Such a widely distributed order was bound to fall into Allied hands. To Skorzeny, his operation was compromised from the start, but his superiors would agree to no cancellation lest Hitler himself learn of the gaffe. "It's idiotic," commented Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, "but it has been done. We cannot hold up your operation now." Scion of an aristocratic old Prussian family from Mecklenburg, Karl Rudolf Gerd von Rundstedt disdained Nazism and Adolf Hitler. Yet like many another of the senior generals, anxious to circumvent the Treaty of Versailles and restore German military strength, he had pledged himself to the Fahneneid, the ancient oath passed down from the Teuton Knights requiring every soldier to obey the Emperor unto death, an oath with which Hitler, like the Kaisers before him, bound his officers. Having enlisted in an infantry regiment as an ensign at the age of 17, von Rundstedt, by the fall of 1944, had been soldiering for more than half a century. Joining the General Staff after the Great War, He had worked hard to dispel the paralysis that the machine gun had engendered, insisting on increased fire support and mobility for the infantrymen. Although he believed fervently in the supremacy of the state over the army and despised politics, in 1938 he so disagreed with Hitler's policies, which he considered to be leading to full-scale war at a time when Germany was grossly unprepared for it, that in company with a dozen other top generals, he resigned. With the invasion of Poland in 1939, he nevertheless accepted a recall to duty and commanded army groups with distinction in Poland, Belgium, France and Russia, before becoming commander-in-chief on the Western Front. Von Rundstedt was to many of his compatriots the prototype of the Prussian officer, stiff, formal, utterly dedicated to his profession. Some saw him as excessively modest, too reserved, a man who led a simple life and was indifferent to money or possessions, one who was affable to inferiors and extravagantly polite to women. He smoked too much and enjoyed an occasional drink. Like most German officers of his time, he had learned the language of the courts. He liked the French, and when in France, chose to speak in French with visiting dignitaries. By the fall of 1944, von Rundstedt's advanced age was showing. The skin on his face was wrinkled like crepe paper, and even as Hitler recalled him once again to duty, he had been taking the cure at Bad Tolz. Establishing his headquarters in Ziegenberg Castle, in the Taunus Hills east of the Rhine near Bad Nauheim, he made few visits to the troops, a practice far different from the old days. Many of his associates saw the noble old man for what Hitler intended him to be, a figurehead. Among them was one of his 3 Army Group commanders, Field Marshal Walter Model of Army Group B, who was destined to be the tactical commander for Hitler's ambitious offensive. A man of humble origins, in no sense of the nobility model, had early tied his career to Hitler's. As von Manteuffel put it, his manner was rough, and his methods were not always acceptable in the higher quarters of the German army, but they were both to Hitler's liking. He was one of only a few among the thoroughly cowed officer corps who still dared to speak his mind to the Führer and occasionally carried his point. Stockily built, Model found it hard to look the stiff, formal Prussian, but with the aid of a monocle, he managed it. In Russia, Model had established a reputation as a lion of defense, and in August 1944, when Hitler needed a lion of defense on the Western Front, he made him commander of Army Group B, and at the same time briefly commander-in-chief in the West. To some, Model appeared not only ardent, but fanatical. When a commander in Normandy insisted that the remnants of his division be pulled from the line for a rest, Model said, "By a line in the east, our divisions take their rest in the front line. And that's how things are going to be done here in the future." And when Model learned that Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had surrendered to the Russians at Stalingrad, he was appalled. "A field marshal," said Model, "does not become a prisoner. Such a thing is just not possible." 16 years von Rundstedt's junior Model treated the old man with due respect, but he ran his army group with little reference to Ziegenberg Castle. Von Rundstedt, for his part, conscious of the peculiar position in which Hitler had placed him, accepted Model's deference as his due, but made no effort to interfere with Model's trading on his prerogative as bearer of a marshal's baton to deal directly with Hitler. Relations between the two were correct, but not cordial. As October passed its midpoint, von Rundstedt at Ziegenberg Castle and Model at his headquarters in a former sanitarium for alcoholics near Krefeld, northeast of Aachen, received summonses to send their chiefs of staff to the Wolfschanze. Neither knew why, but both assumed for a taste of Hitler's cola, for the Americans had finally captured Aachen, the first German city of appreciable size to fall. Von Rundstedt nevertheless instructed his chief of staff, General de Cavalerie Siegfried Westphal, to seize the occasion to press his repeated unanswered pleas for reinforcements to prevent a breakthrough beyond Aachen to the Rhine. Arriving at the Wolfschanze on the morning of October 22nd, General Westphal and Model's chief of staff, General de Infanterie Hans Krebs, first had to sign the pledge required of those let in on Hitler's secret to guard it or be shot. Following the Führer's daily situation conference, all but 15 of the participants were asked to leave, whereupon Hitler himself took the floor. To the surprise of Westphal and Krebs, he said not a word about the fall of Aachen. Instead, he unfolded an astounding plan, Wacht am Rhein. As Westphal and Krebs listened in stunned silence, Hitler outlined the forces that were to be employed. There were to be 30 divisions, 18 infantry, and 12 panzer or panzergrenadier divisions. To Westphal and Krebs, such largesse was heady news, but their enthusiasm cooled when Hitler told them that von Rundstedt's command would have to provide 9 of the divisions, including 6 panzer divisions. Those would have to be pulled from the line in sufficient time to be refitted with replacements in men and equipment before the offensive. For general fire support, there were to be 5 motorized anti-aircraft regiments, 12 artillery corps, and 10 rocket projector brigades. There would also be additional general support troops, such as engineer and signal battalions, and the Luftwaffe was to provide at least 1,500 planes, including 100 of the new jets. Although Hitler said that he wanted to attack early in November, it would be impossible to assemble all the troops by that time, so that the offensive was to begin on November 25th, a date. His meteorologists had promised him that assured inclement weather with poor visibility to conceal the build-up. In the meantime, he intoned there was to be no let-up in the defensive battle, yet not one of the formations intended for Wacht am Rhein was to be committed to bolster the defence. With that, Hitler dismissed his generals, ordering them to return to their headquarters and draw up detailed operational plans. When Westphal reported back to his chief, von Rundstedt was appalled. While admitting that Hitler's choice of the Ardennes for the offensive represented a stroke of genius, he saw the plan as far too ambitious. As he was to put it later, absolutely all conditions for the possible success of such an offensive were lacking. Even to hold on along the frontier while the men and supplies for the offensive were readied would be problem enough, for there were clear indications that the Americans were preparing new drives in both north and south. 1st and 9th Armies in the Aachen sector and the 3rd Army in Lorraine. If the German armies should reach and cross the Meuse, which von Rundstedt seriously doubted they could do, both flanks would be highly vulnerable, and to expect to advance all the way to Antwerp without encountering a major counterblow was crediting the Allied commanders with a languor and a dearth of resources they had yet to exhibit. About all Hitler's plan could be expected to achieve in von Rundstedt's view was a salient or bulge in the line, costly and indecisive, like those Ludend Orff had forged during the Great War. It was with considerable relief that von Rundstedt learned that Hitler's fair-haired boy Walter Model shared his misgivings. This plan, Model said, when General Krebs presented it to him, hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. Without consulting each other, both commanders adopted the same method of trying to whittle down the grandiose scope of their Führer's plan by devising an alternative more in keeping with the reality of German resources. To both, Antwerp as an objective was out of the question. Von Rundstedt proposed a drive through the Ardennes to cross the Meuse between Liège and the bend at Namur for a juncture with a simultaneous attack launched from the north, thereby trapping the Americans around Aachen in a double encirclement. Model proposed instead a single encirclement with all the forces committed through the Ardennes, then driving north. On October 27th, von Rundstedt went to Model's headquarters to discuss Hitler's proposal and his and Model's suggested alternatives. The 3 army commanders who were to be involved, Sepp Dietrich, Hasso von Manteuffel, and Erich Brandenberger, also participated in what was their first initiation into the secret brotherhood in which they were to serve as potentates. After several hours of discussion, von Rundstedt directed Model to resolve the differences between their 2 plans. Conscious that the 2 commanders needed to present a united front if they were to have any power of persuasion with Hitler, Model prepared a final plan almost identical to von Rundstedt's. As the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, General von Manteuffel, put it, was a matter of the grand slam Hitler's plan versus the little slam von Rundstedt and Model's. Von Manteuffel was an avid fan of contract bridge. In time, the generals came to refer to them as the big solution and the small solution. Since the small solution was virtually the same as that proposed earlier by General Jodl, its chances of getting past the Führer were predictably thin. That failed to deter the old soldier and the ardent young Nazi commander from joining forces to do battle. In the first place, they sensed an ally in Alfred Jodl. In the second, although well aware that Hitler as supreme dictator had debased, broken and even executed many of their compatriots, while they and most of the others in the officer corps had looked on benignly. They were also aware that there were few field marshals of their stature and proven loyalty left to do the Führer's bidding. They were in a position to risk the Führer's fury. They sensed Jodel's thinking when on November 2nd, a courier brought a written copy of Hitler's plan with a covering note from Jodl. In the note, Jodl wrote that Antwerp as the objective was unalterable, but he added, although from a strictly technical standpoint, it appears to be disproportionate to our available forces. He continued, in our present situation, however, we must not shrink from staking everything on one card. The next day, when Jodl followed up the written instructions by visiting Model's headquarters, he faced the combined protests of von Rundstedt Model and von Manteuffel, whom von Rundstedt had personally invited to be present. Von Manteuffel, as von Rundstedt intended, carried the weight of the argument, a fresh voice in the controversy. General, he said to Jodl, I think under your plan that we can reach the Meuse, but only if certain conditions are met. Every man, every tank, every plane, every gallon of gasoline, every round of ammunition as promised by Hitler would have to be on hand when the movement began, and the attack by the 7th Army to protect the south flank would have to be materially strengthened. As von Manteuffel's statement inferred, he saw no possibility of an advance beyond the Meuse on Antwerp. Jodl had thus heard another advocate of the small solution, but he had his orders. The Führer's plan, he replied, was irrevocable. A week later, on November 10th, the issue appeared to be closed when Hitler signed a formal operational directive specifying an offensive exactly as he himself had originally envisaged it. Yet the man with over a half-century of honourable service in the uniform of his country continued to protest, striving to spare the troops whose trust he bore the sure debacle he envisaged if Hitler persisted in his plan. Along with Model, von Rundstedt proposed yet another small solution, an attack from the north, with some of the divisions scheduled for Wacht am Rhein into the northern flank of the American 9th Army, which on November 16th, along with the 1st Army, had begun a major offensive in the Aachen sector but had failed to achieve a breakthrough. That posed a chance to destroy some 14 American divisions, which would have been weakened by their offensive, thereby setting up conditions conducive to a big German offensive to be mounted later on the order of the one Hitler had in mind. Hitler saw through the gambit. Preparations for an improvisation, Jodl replied in Hitler's name, will not be made. Yet when it became apparent that the target date of November 25th was unrealistic, and Hitler agreed to delay until December 10th, von Rundstedt vowed to continue to try to effect a change. He saw a chance when Hitler called him and Model to a conference at the Reichschancellery in Berlin on December 2nd. Pleading preoccupation at the front, he sent his chief of staff Westphal to represent him, a form of protest not to be lost on Hitler, but he also sent two whom he hoped still might persuade Hitler to reconsider von Manteuffel, who obviously stood high in the Führer's regard, or he would not have brought him as a relatively junior general from the Eastern Front for such a major assignment in the offensive, and Hitler's old crony, Sepp Dietrich. Nobody, including von Rundstedt, thought highly of Dietrich, but he was a favourite of Hitler's, and to his military colleagues he had already made clear the derision he felt for the job assigned him and the 6th Panzer Army. All Hitler wants me to do is to cross a river, capture Brussels, and then go on and take Antwerp. And all this in the worst time of the year, through the Ardennes, where the snow is waist-deep, and there isn't room to deploy 4 tanks abreast, let alone armoured divisions, where it doesn't get light until 8, and it's dark again at 4, and with reformed divisions made up chiefly of kids and sick old men and at Christmas. Von Manteuffel and Dietrich constituted von Rundstedt's big artillery, his fortress guns detailed to fire a final decisive salvo. Yet the rounds fell short. Dietrich failed to speak at all, and von Manteuffel achieved only some minor changes, mostly of a tactical nature. Hitler nevertheless threw a sop to his faithful Nazi, Walter Model, by changing the codename to that used by Model in his plan for a small solution. That was all. What the field commanders failed to recognize or to accept was the desperation that lay behind Hitler's plan, a desperation reinforced by the Führer's megalomania and his distrust of his generals, whose ineptitude and disloyalty he was convinced were responsible for bringing Nazi Germany to the brink of destruction. From the day his generals tried to kill him, he had been convinced that he and he alone could save Germany, that some divine providence had spared him for that role, and that the way to do it was to exploit the dissensions he deemed inherent in the misalliance of his adversaries, and to continue this battle until, as Frederick the Great said, one of our damned enemies gets too tired to fight anymore. Destroying 10 or 14 or 20 American divisions around Aachen would not do it.